Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hello, I'm your host, Ken Ford, IHMC's founder and CEO Emeritus. Rumor has it that I also chair the double secret selection committee responsible for choosing all the guests who appear on STEM Talk. My co-host, Dawn, is still playing hooky, so I'm flying solo for this episode. Today we have Dr. Judith Curry, a prominent climatologist who is making her second appearance on STEM Talk. Judith was our guest on episode 158, and I do recommend that you have a listen to that episode. She is president of the Climate Forecast Application Network and the host of the blog Climate Etc., which you can find at judithcurry.com. Her blog provides a forum for climate researchers, academics, and technical experts from other fields, as well as citizen scientists, to discuss topics related to climate science and science policy. This year, Judith was one of 5 researchers recruited by the Department of Energy to draft a new climate assessment report. This team, consisting of independent experts, were commissioned to summarize the current state of climate science, with a focus on how it relates to the United States in particular. Today we will be talking to her about the report and its findings, as well as some of the controversies surrounding it. Judith's research interests include hurricane, remote sensing, atmospheric modeling, polar climates, air-sea interactions, climate models, and the use of unmanned aerial vehicles for atmospheric research. She has published more than 100 scientific papers and is the author of Climate Change and Uncertainty: Rethinking Our Response. This book provides a framework for understanding and rethinking the climate change debate. Before we jump into our conversation with Judith, we have a little bit of housekeeping to take care of. First, a big thank you to everyone who has subscribed to STEM Talk, and an extra thanks to all of you who have left those wonderful 5-star reviews. If you're new to the show and you like what you hear, please consider subscribing. And if you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love for you to take a moment to rate the show and maybe even leave us a review. It really helps us reach more people who might also enjoy STEM Talk. As always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been hard at work, scouring iTunes and other podcast apps for the sharpest, funniest, and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to share on STEM Talk. If yours makes the cut and you hear it on the show, send us a note at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your very own STEM Talk t-shirt, proof that the committee does, in fact, exist. Today, our winning review was posted by someone who goes by the moniker Crunch 2020, 5 stars. The review is titled 5 stars. It reads, "Yours is the most reliable medical science podcast on the internet. While we all enjoy the chance to purchase some supplements or some organic nut butter that most YouTubers provide, you only give us knowledge to digest. While my brain is fully nourished, my body needs a sweet STEM Talk shirt. Keep up the great work, Ken and Dawn." Thank you, Crunch 2020, and thanks to all our other STEM Talk listeners who have helped STEM Talk become such a great success. Okay, and now on to today's interview with Dr. Judith Curry.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Judith, welcome back to STEM Talk. It's been 2 years since we last talked. For you, and frankly for all of us, these 2 years have been quite eventful. You were one of the 5 authors of a new climate assessment report that was commissioned by the United States Department of Energy. One of the key findings of the report, which was released this past summer, is that carbon dioxide-induced warming of the planet appears to be less damaging economically than has commonly been believed. The report also argues that aggressive mitigation strategies for carbon dioxide could actually be more harmful than helpful. While you're used to being somewhat of a contrarian, you found yourself really in the crosshairs of several environmental groups, including the American Meteorological Society, as a result of this report. But before we delve into the specifics and controversies of the report and the media backlash that you faced, can you first explain how you became one of the 5 authors of this report?
Okay, well, Energy Secretary Chris Wright is the person in the Trump administration that is most knowledgeable and interested in the climate issue. So, he decided to take this on. And the first thing that he wanted to do to serve as a foundation for, any policy related change, including reconsideration of the EPA endangerment finding, was to get an updated assessment of climate science that was really a critique of what the IPCC and the U.S. National Climate Assessment reports have said. So what he did, apparently he made a list of 10 people that he was interested in having do this study, and he started calling the people on his list. And I think he got to me, number 4, I think, and, told me what he was looking to do, the other people that he'd invited, and one additional person he was thinking of inviting. And I said, oh, this sounds great. Let me know how I can help. So, all 5 of the people that he initially invited said yes. And the climate working group was born.
That sounds like the typical way these come together, but this is a smaller, more focused group than usual, and having the secretary directly involved was probably a helpful and a good thing. You mentioned that you and your 4 co-authors are known or became known as the Climate Working Group. While some critics of the report have characterized you and your co-authors as sort of hand-picked skeptics of the effects of climate change, you have described yourself and your co-authors as scientists who have a staunch mindset of getting the facts and the science right. Can you talk about your co-authors and your relationship with them?
Okay, well, my co-authors were John Christie, Roy Spencer, Steve Koonin, and Ross McKittrick. I've met each of these individuals several times. I've never collaborated with them, but I'm very familiar with their work and very knowledgeable about their position in the public debate on climate change. So I saw no reason not to want to work with these individuals. Within the team, John Christie and Roy Spencer are close collaborators, and John Christie has also collaborated significantly with Ross McKittrick. But Steve Koonin and myself haven't really collaborated with the others in scientific publications. So it was sort of a new collaboration. And it was Secretary Wright asked about other people that we thought should be added to the group, but we thought that given the short time fuse for this, we thought that 5 people was about the right size. And we each felt that the other members of the team were objective. So, we didn't, we expected there would be disagreements and whatever, but we felt that given the objectivity of the team, that these could be resolved by simply saying there's uncertainty, there's disagreement, and that's the way these issues should be addressed rather than trying to enforce some sort of a consensus. So this report was very deliberately not a consensus-seeking report. It was, here's what we know, here's what we don't know.
That sounds a good way to go. I served on a large study. It was a national security study on AI, a commission on AI, and all the commissioners, were qualified to be on the study. But when you have 15 commissioners and a very large professional staff supporting the study, and you're told that it has to be a consensus report, a lot of stuff just has to be left out. And you really can't get into a lot of the most interesting issues if it's to truly be a consensus among 15 people, or I would say even across 5 people. So I'm glad it wasn't a consensus report. I find those somewhat less satisfying. So first, I'd like to focus on the science and key findings of the report. The report argues that the economic damage from carbon dioxide-induced warming is less severe than it's typically portrayed. Could you help listeners understand how you reached that conclusion?
Well, specifically with regards to economic damage, key drivers in the damage function used in these assessments are harms to agriculture and also mortality from extreme weather events. So with regards to agriculture, a lot of those assessments are very narrow related to increasing temperature can hurt this crop, and therefore there's damage. They fail to account that farmers adapt by, planting different crops or different hybrids. But most importantly, they forgot the part about where carbon dioxide is plant food. We emphasize that the planet is greening since about 1980 when we have global satellite observations, and a big part of that is increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The other part of it is warmer temperatures and more rain. So this is a good thing for the planet. But not only does it help just overall vegetation on the planet, it helps plants. So, all of these damage models involving agriculture were ignoring that increasing CO2 helps crops grow. I mean, this is well known. If you have a greenhouse, you're pumping carbon dioxide in it to help, pump the plant growth. The other issue relates to mortality from extreme weather events. Our report documents that apart from heat and cold events, there's really no support for thinking that global warming is worsening extreme weather. Specifically with regards to heat and cold events, we're seeing an increase, in an overall warming climate, we see an increase in extreme heat and a decrease in extreme cold. But the part they don't tell you about in these IPCC reports is that mortality from cold events is an order of magnitude higher than from extreme heat events. I mean, this holds up globally, and it's been known for decades, but you never see that mentioned. So overall, there's a reduction in mortality from temperature extremes as the climate warms. And not only that, people are adapting to warmer climates, and mortality from extreme heat is going down even as the temperatures increase. So, I mean, if these are the two big drivers for economic damage, well, they don't really hold up to closer scrutiny.
Right. And it's kind of surprising that people didn't consider those factors when writing the initial report. It would strike me that those are both relatively obvious.
Well, part of the problem is that the instructions that these assessment report writers are given is to focus on dangerous human-caused climate change. Okay, so if it's not dangerous, they ignore it. And if it's caused by natural variability, they ignore it. So, it's sort of their instructions were to ignore these pieces of the puzzle. But that's a big mistake in terms of torquing the science in unfortunate directions, not to mention misleading policymakers.
Absolutely. As any attorney knows, a trial attorney knows, the instructions given to the jury are very important. The report also argues that aggressive climate mitigation strategies have sometimes been more harmful than helpful. Could you share some examples of that, where the mitigation strategy was more harmful than helpful?
Well, the main mitigation strategy has been to get rid of fossil fuel power plants and replace them with wind and solar farms. Okay. We've spent trillions and trillions of dollars, and globally, the reduction in fossil fuel use has only been a few percent. So we've spent trillions of dollars on something that's ineffective, and that money could have been used in better ways. For countries and regions that have been very proactive in implementing wind and solar power, Spain is an example. They find that they're having huge problems with their electric power systems in terms of intermittency and blackouts. I mean, the technology is just not just not going to work without solid baseload backup power. Germany, who is also very aggressive in implementing wind and solar and getting rid of all of its nuclear power plant, electricity is crazy expensive and not as abundant as is needed. And they've essentially destroyed most of their industry in Germany, as a result of this transition.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing where it's really been harmful is that development money, from the World Bank and, UN and places like that, trying to alleviate poverty and hunger and whatever in Africa and other underdeveloped countries, all of that money is tied up in sort of green initiatives. So the development has just vastly slowed down in these countries, and all this money is being frittered away on, wind and solar power, and it's not really helping them develop their own resources, and it's not helping them, providing enough power to support industrial development. So it's set back development very substantially. And all this in an attempt to reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, or at least stabilize it. And that's not going, even if you believe the climate models and even if net zero was successful, we wouldn't notice any change to the climate and extreme weather events before the 21st century. So all of this has been an exercise in futility, and we've squandered all these resources that could have been used to support development and reduce our vulnerability to extreme weather and climate events.
Yes, that's a good description. And following up on that, is it fair to say that one of the most key findings of the report is that we need to redirect climate science away from what you might characterize as alarmism and toward a focus on better understanding of the natural climate variability?
Yeah, they've sold the story that carbon dioxide is some sort of a control knob, on the climate. And I mean, carbon dioxide does influence, the climate, but there's a whole lot of other things that influence the climate much more. Natural climate variability. This relates to the sun. The sun's effect on the climate is huge and underappreciated. Volcanic eruptions. In the early 1800s, there were 3 explosive volcanic eruptions that changed the course of the climate over the 19th century. The large-scale ocean circulations have time scales of variability from a few years to a few thousand years, and these are of huge importance to determining the regional climate and even the average climate of the Earth. El Nino and La Nina, those are high-frequency examples, but there's a whole spectrum. And you know what a big impact that this has, well, it certainly does on Florida. You know what a big impact El Nino and La Nina has on our weather and climate. But you have these same magnitude of impacts, but on longer time scales, on decadal, multi-decadal, century, millennial time scales. And these have very large impacts on the weather, the climate, the ice sheets, all sorts of things. And we're not paying this enough attention. We're focused on CO2 as a control knob and playing games with climate models that really aren't fit for purpose for understanding or predicting the variability of climate.
Speaking of climate variability, do you have thoughts on what we need to better understand natural climate variability in terms of what are some next steps in terms of research in that direction?
Well, here's a problem. Back when I was, a graduate student around 1980, I mean, we had a very solid education in weather and climate dynamics. It was really geophysical fluid dynamics, and this is at the heart of understanding climate, weather and climate variability and change. And many of the, let's say, climate science has been very much diluted by climate impacts and geochemistry and ecosystem science and economics and all these other things that are really impacts of climate. They don't help us understand the causes. So at this point, there's only a handful of universities in the U.S. that have good, solid programs in geophysical fluid dynamics that are teaching people the dynamics that we need to understand the climate system. And the other thing is solar variability and its impacts on climate. I mean, this is really something that occurs more in astrophysics departments rather than, earth science departments. But there's a whole lot of impacts of the sun on climate that are indirect and inadequately understood and certainly not included in the global climate models. So there's tons of really exciting research that needs to be done that is really being ignored as the graduate students spending their time analyzing the output of climate models rather than, really trying to understand how all this works.
Well said. I understand some of your favorite sections of the report are Chapter 6, 8, and 11. Chapter 6 focuses on the relationship between global warming and extreme weather events. This chapter provided a nice overview of the difficulty that's been involved in linking specific extreme weather events, like hurricanes, for example, as you mentioned earlier, to climate change. And you argue that's largely due to the rarity and variability of these occurrences. You also point out that short historical records, when I say short, I mean short for geologic type events and weather and climate events, do not provide reliable data to detect trends in extreme weather. Could you elaborate on these issues a little bit here?
Well, if you read the IPCC report or the U.S. National Climate Assessment and you look at the sections on extreme weather events, you see data shown from 1970 or 1950, and you probably see some big trends. The part that they don't tell you is that if you look at the first half of the 20th century, particularly the 1930s, the weather extremes, particularly in the U.S., were much worse than anything we're currently seeing. The worst heat waves, the worst droughts, the worst forest fires, even the worst U.S. landfalling hurricanes. And they conveniently leave out the 1930s. So what we did in Chapter 6 is we showed all the data as far back as we could go, and that was generally back to 1920, 1900, and in a few cases even back to the 1800s. And sure enough, you don't see anything that's unusual about what's going on, say, in the 21st century in terms of extreme weather events. So it's, you have to look back, and some of the worst, like weather disasters that, this country has faced were really before the 20th century. One of the examples we used in the report was the horrendous sequence of atmospheric rivers, those big moisture plumes coming in from the Pacific and dumping a whole lot of rain on California. Well, in the winter of 1861 to 1862, a sequence of events dumped 15 feet of rain in the Central Valley of California, and the whole valley was flooded, 10 feet under for many months. Okay? And, was that particularly unusual? Well, they looked at the sediment records, and it seems these kind of crazy big events occur about every 200 years. And the one in 1861 was by no means the biggest one. Okay. So it would be almost surprising if we didn't see another one of those huge events in the 21st century. And, claiming that global warming is making atmospheric rivers worse, well, possibly by a tiny bit, but in terms of the horrendously bad events, they all occurred hundreds of years ago. Even in the Little Ice Age, we were getting horrendous atmospheric river events. So just looking at that short time period since 1970 is very, very misleading in terms of understanding extreme weather events.
Yes, and you wonder, often in these kinds of things, you wonder about why the line was drawn where it was. Without, considering motive, it would strike one as that was a very clear benefit if your desired outcome was as we received, right?
Exactly. It's cherry picking. You can cherry pick the start date, to give you whatever kind of trend you want.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't help with understanding of anything.
I mentioned earlier, Chapter 9 of the report was another one that you quite like, and that's the part that argues that the economic damage that's attributed to carbon dioxide emissions is often overstated. And we discussed this a little bit earlier, and also in this chapter, it's where the potential benefits of increased carbon dioxide levels are discussed, such as increased plant growth and enhanced agricultural productivity. And we also discussed that a little earlier. The third chapter that I understand that you took a particular liking to is Chapter 11. There, it's emphasized that as we continue to experience climate change, we need to focus on adapting by reducing our vulnerabilities in infrastructure, ecosystems, and in our communities. Can you give us some examples of how communities and countries can go about mitigating the associated risks of climate change, if you even want to characterize it that way? Climate has always changed, and we humans adapt. So could you tell us about that?
Well, it's about, there's soft and hard adaptation. Hard adaptation is, infrastructure, building codes, dams, seawalls, these kind of things. Soft adaptation is really emergency management procedures, you know, preventing the wildfires by turning off the electricity and things like that. So, since you're in Florida, I'll give you a few Florida examples. The building codes that you implemented following Hurricane Andrew, has been, it costs money, but that's a great example of adaptation. So, the most robust buildings are able to survive, the hurricane landfalls. A soft adaptation example is Florida Power and Light, who, if you live in their territory, even after a hurricane, your power is out 1, maybe 2 days. And they have this amazing protocol, invested a huge amount of money in readiness in terms of the technologies that they use to anticipate and manage the impacts of a hurricane landfall. I think I gave details of that particular example in chapter 13 of my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk. But those are examples of things you can do. And dams, okay, the big floods following Hurricane Helene and the flooding in North Carolina. Part of the problem is that the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, that was chartered to prevent these kind of floods, sort of didn't complete the job around Asheville because the citizens there, it's a beautiful place. They enjoy their scenery and didn't want a dam nearby. And as a result, their water wasn't managed very well. But, the dams and the hurricane warnings are saving billions and billions of dollars each year in terms of damage that didn't happen in the U.S. And the challenge is to, translate that to countries that are less economically developed, and Africa being a key case. And so, the most important thing that we can do to help those countries is to help them develop wealth and give them access to grid electricity. Mm-hmm. Then you have a basis for actually doing the kind of adaptation things that we've successfully done in the U.S.
Yes, I agree. I think a stable and cost-effective power grid drives so much development and so much human advancement, and not having that is a real showstopper. And you could see it, as you mentioned earlier, in parts of Europe. The energy infrastructure is just unraveling. You mentioned Spain, but you see the deindustrialization of Germany and other places. And it's, I think, when you think about Africa, the thing that is most needed is high-quality, stable power.
For sure.
Well, I want to back up just for a second and address your view of climate change as, I've heard you characterized as a climate change denier. I particularly hate when they stick the word denier after anything. They're trying to evoke this sort of symbolism of Holocaust deniers or something. But I have heard you characterized as a climate change denier, and by that they mean someone who doesn't accept that global warming is actually happening. But that's not the case in your instance, is it?
Of course not. No, that's sort of ridiculous. But the word denier is also used to insult people who think, yeah, it's warming, but it's not dangerous. Mm-hmm. Or, yeah, it's warming and maybe it's dangerous, but rapid wholesale adoption of renewable energy and kneecapping fossil fuels is a bad strategy. Those people also get called climate deniers.
For sure.
Jim Hansen, arguably the grandfather of global warming scare, He's a proponent of nuclear power, and they even call him a denier because he thinks wind and solar power are fairly useless. So the word denier is a political term that's used to attack anyone who disagrees with the establishment.
And there are other fields like this too. I mean, you saw in the COVID response, essentially it's an ad hominem attack. People aren't arguing about the science or about data. It's just, so these are bad people.
Yeah, it's cancel culture, applied to science. They're trying to, cancel us, and it hasn't worked very well.
No, it hasn't. And I think over time it might even work less well.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research organization investigating a broad range of topics aimed at understanding and extending human cognition, locomotion, health span, resilience, and performance.
Recently, you and your colleague, Dr. Harry D'Angelo, a professor at the Marshall School of Business at the University of Southern California, wrote a paper titled A Critique of the Apocalyptic Climate Narrative. In this paper, you detail what you consider the flaws of the apocalyptic climate narrative, including why the threat from human-caused climate change is not as dire as we are led to believe, and why urgent suppression of fossil fuel use is unwise. We've talked about both of these a little bit earlier today, but could you give us an overview of this paper and the arguments that are made in it?
Well, first, a little bit of context for this paper. Harry D'Angelo is a professor of finance at USC, and he's very concerned about all the investments that are going into like these green initiatives, ESG investing, and things like that. He thinks not only is, this a waste, of money, it's not where the money should most productively go, but that these investors are vulnerable, to, reality checks and political changes of political whims. So he felt that this community of academic finance people, by the way, the paper was published in the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance, so that gives you a sense of who the audience for this is. They were all scared, well, none of this is what we should be most concerned about. If this is really an existential threat, a catastrophe, a crisis, we urgently need to reduce fossil fuel emissions, then, we just need to invest this money anyways. And so the main theme of this paper is to get rid of the urgency, of doing anything here. The key points, that we made in the DOE report, many of them were comparable, related to the extreme emissions scenarios are now off the table. The extreme values of climate sensitivity to increasing carbon dioxide are off the table. Climate models, there's growing distrust of climate models and realization that they're inadequate for predicting climate change in the 21st century. And also the part about extreme weather events that we've already discussed about. So laying all this out. And then the second half of the paper is really how we should view the 21st century energy transition from a risk management perspective. And so we lay out many of the arguments that I made in chapter 14 of my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, about how to, assess the dangers from weather and climate variability facing, our power systems, the benefits that fossil fuels have conferred on humanity, and that we can't, easily dismiss those benefits without an adequate replacement. And, the land use issues and all the kinds of trade-offs that you should be considering when evaluating how we should proceed with the 21st century energy transition. And apart from the CO2 issue, we do need a 21st century energy transition because the world needs a lot more electricity, orders of magnitude probably, over the course of the 21st century. And we need to figure out how to provide abundant and inexpensive energy to the world while at the same time, making it, minimizing the environmental impact as much as we can. And with regards to the environmental impact, I think CO2 emissions are the least of the issues. I think real pollution, air and water pollution, is a bigger deal. The other factor is land use and resource use. There's no way we can just cover the world's land, with wind and solar farms. I mean, there's other things that we want to do with the land, not to mention the adverse impacts on ecosystems. So all of these things need to be considered in a holistic way. So that's the main points that we were trying to make in the paper. And it was quite well received in the community, which, it's one that I haven't. Some of my clients are arguably for my company are in the financial sector, but I hadn't really interacted with academics in the financial sector. So it was quite interesting. And I really enjoyed collaborating with Harry D'Angelo. And I think it's a good paper that has broad appeal even beyond the financial sector.
We'll be sure to include links to all the papers we discuss and to your book and also to the Department of Energy report that we discussed earlier in our show notes to make it convenient for the listeners. Your views on climate alarmism now seem to be at least partly shared by Bill Gates. He recently wrote a memo on his website which argued we need to pivot away from the doomsday view that cataclysmic climate change is going to decimate humanity. This is a pretty significant about-face for someone who in 2021 published a book titled How to Avoid Climate Disaster, a book where he urged policies for net zero emissions. A few media outlets reached out to you for comment about Gates' change of heart, and you described it as refreshing. You also said that you are beginning to sense what you describe as climate alarmism fatigue. Can you expand on this a little bit?
Okay, first the climate alarmism fatigue thing. Peak alarm, followed the 2015 Paris Agreement when the UN people were amping up the rhetoric, code red, and all of this kind of thing. And students and kids were being very frightened by this and depression and, all of it was people were scared. They were very worried about it. They thought doomsday was on us. Okay. And then COVID hit. Okay. And that was a real crisis, took everybody's mind off climate change for a while. And then after COVID subsided, now 10 years later, okay, where's the climate catastrophe? It's nowhere to be seen. So people are just exhausted. They see that it's been overhyped, and they're moving on to other things that are more important. Now, with regards to Bill Gates, I think he can see that happening. And so the first part of his essay, where we need to move away from the doomsday rhetoric, I mean, that was very well said and very well taken. But if you read towards the second half and the full essay that he wrote, he's still pushing the same technologies, many of which are not just wasteful, they're dangerous. As a solar radiation management, dumping aerosols into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight, to cool off the planet.
Yeah, it's madness.
I know, putting the Bovaer additive into cattle feed to reduce the methane from their flatulence. I mean, this is killing cows in Europe, and there are all sorts. He's still pushing renewable energy. He's still pushing batteries. He's still pushing non-meat meat. He still thinks population is too high, trying to reduce population. So his solutions are 95% bad, in my opinion, either wasteful or dangerous. So I'm not giving Bill Gates a pass on this, but he did shift the dialogue in terms of dropping the doomsday rhetoric.
Yes, and it received a lot of press coverage, and so in a sense, that's a good thing. Another subject of the Department of Energy climate report that has been widely contested has to do with sea levels. And this is covered in Chapter 7 of the report. A number of groups object to the report's statement that United States tide gauge measurements in aggregate show no obvious acceleration in sea level rise beyond the historical average rate. Yet the conventional thinking has been that sea level rise has been accelerating, and one hears this continuously. There was a paper, however, that was released earlier this year, and after the release of the DOE report, the paper was titled The Global Perspective on Local Sea Level Changes. It found that 95% of the suitable global locations show no statistically significant acceleration of the rate of sea level rise. Can you give us your perspective on sea level changes?
Okay, here's some context. In 2016, I started doing a deep dive into the sea level rise issue. This was motivated by several different groups of lawyers who were dealing with lawsuits related to fossil fuels companies causing local sea level rise in San Francisco, Rhode Island, a whole bunch of places. And what they wanted from me is they wanted to understand the whole issue. So could I write a document that would lead them through the whole thing, a tutorial of the terminology and all this kind of thing, how to interpret the projections, how to interpret local sea level rise and all this. So I read hundreds of papers, and I took 2 years to do this, and I wrote a 100-page report. Since then, I generally kept up with the literature, but it wasn't at the top of my priorities. So when it came time to write the chapter for the DOE report, I stepped back and said, well, what do people really need to know here? And I said, well, the most instructive thing is just to look at the tide gauge records. You can go to a page on the NOAA website and look at the local tide gauge records and interpret it. What you see is an increasing trend. Different locations, it's increasing at different rates, largely because of vertical land motion, but also because of ocean circulation patterns. They tend to be lower rates on the Pacific coast and higher rates on the Atlantic coast. And while you see ups and downs in terms of, sometimes the rate is higher, sometimes it's lower, overall, the rate of sea level increase is very linear. And, there's no obvious acceleration. Okay, well, this upset people. So let's talk about acceleration and why do they think it's accelerating. So first look at global sea level rise. And they do this since 1993. We've had satellite altimeter observations that can be used to deduce sea level rise. And so you can look at the data in two different ways. And I'm going to use a bathtub analogy here. So if you take a bathtub and you put 6 inches of water in the bathtub, and then you add a third more water, that would bring the water level to 8 inches. However, if you have an expanding bathtub that's expanding while you're adding the new water, then you're not going to get 2 inches of rise. It's going to be something smaller depending on how much bigger you made the bathtub. Say, well, what does this have to do with the oceans? Well, because of the rebound of the Earth's crust from the last ice age and even the little ice age, both the big and the little ice age, in most of the ocean is actually deepening. Okay, so the size of the bathtub is getting bigger. So if you look at the global sea level data, and you assume a constant bathtub size, there is acceleration from adding more water into the oceans. But if you don't correct, you don't artificially keep the bathtub the same size, and you consider the deepening of the oceans, that completely cancels out any recent acceleration in global sea level, because fortuitously, the deepening of the global ocean is canceling out the acceleration from adding more water because of warming. Now, the other issue with global sea level rise is that if you look back at the tide gauge records and the global composites from tide gauge records, it's very obvious that global sea level rise, it increased between 1920 and 1950 at the same rate as it's currently increasing now. Okay, and even the IPCC recognizes this, and they said, but that was natural internal variability. We don't need to pay attention to it. Okay, but then you have to ask, well, how much is natural internal variability contributing to the current increase. And it certainly is, particularly with regards to melting of Greenland, which goes through nominally 60 to 80 year oscillations when it's melting versus when it's increasing. So with regards to global acceleration, there's nothing unusual in the recent acceleration that we haven't seen in the early part of the 20th century. And further, if you allow for the fact that the ocean basins are increasing, the recent apparent acceleration is canceled out. Now, if we look at individual tide gauges to see at an individual location, let's say Pensacola, Florida, you see a lot of variability in the tide gauges. That's mostly linear. I mean, you see tidal cycles, you see El Nino, La Nina, you see multi-decadal effects. So you see a lot of different things. And so the claim that people who criticize this say that since 1970, overall, there has been, on average, there's been acceleration in the U.S. tide gauge record. Well, there's two problems with that. It depends on how you analyze the data. It depends on the statistical method. It depends on whether you filter out the decadal tidal cycles. It depends on whether you filter out the multi-decadal ocean oscillations. I mean, you can get either acceleration or deceleration depending on how you analyze the data. And the other thing is, if you only look since 1970, you miss out on that early period from 1920 to 1950 when acceleration was really high. But the most dishonest thing, in my opinion, by saying the U.S. average acceleration, you only see acceleration on the northern Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast south of Chesapeake Bay. And the source of that acceleration is actually the local ocean dynamics. Okay, in the Gulf of Mexico, in the last maybe 20 years, the eddy sizes in the loop current are increasing. Okay, and this has been shown to be a big contributor to the recent acceleration in Gulf Coast sea level rise. Along the Atlantic coast, there are also a lot of dynamical factors that are contributing to the recent acceleration in those areas. But in other regions, it's decelerating or zero. So if you average, those few accelerating stations, then you claim that the U.S. on average is seeing an acceleration. So there's very, very weak evidence to support acceleration and sea level rise. And I still think, after all the obfuscation that the sea level community threw at us, in reviewing that report, at the end of the day, just look at the tide gauge record and say, is there any recent bump that looks unusual relative to the historic record? And the answer is no. I'm in the process of revising that chapter. I should be finished this week. And it's about not quite triple in length. So I've added a lot of material to it. But at the end of the day, and maybe 30 more references, but at the end of the day, the conclusion is unchanged. The arguments for acceleration are fairly flimsy.
Doesn't actual subsidence of the ground in some areas play a role?
Oh, this is huge. The vertical land motion, this is the point that I made. Yeah, it's huge, especially for like Galveston and New Orleans,
Yes.
Where the subsidence is huge. So there's many sources of sinking or subsidence. One is this glacial rebound, which is a big deal on the Atlantic coast, but particularly in Galveston, it's groundwater withdrawal and even gas and oil extraction. I mean, because of water withdrawal, the city of Houston has sunk like 20 feet in the last 50 years, largely because of groundwater withdrawal and compression, from all the buildings. So a lot of this is land use. And this is something that has to be factored out. And the other thing is, we have GPS measurements now and satellite altimeter measurements to help us sort out the vertical land motion. But going back in time, it's hard to interpret the tide gauge record in terms of what the vertical land motion was doing back then, especially related to land use issues. So there's a lot of uncertainties in all this. And teasing out a tiny value of acceleration depends on, some sleights of hand that to me aren't very defensible, and at the end of the day, not very important.
Yes, that seems to be the case. And anybody who's spent much time in the northern Gulf Coast, you mentioned Galveston, New Orleans, the area south of New Orleans, as it sort of blends, the land blends little by little into the Gulf. You can see obvious issues there, many of which having to do with land usage, but the land itself is subsiding pretty obviously.
Well, New Orleans is an interesting case, as part of the issue is how we engineered the Mississippi River to prevent floods. This has reduced the silt and the continual building up of the delta that helps stabilize sea level.
For sure.
That's not happening because of the engineering we've done to the Mississippi River.
Also, in that region, that very important region south of New Orleans, you see massive changes due to the oil and gas industry and cutting pathways through which had been relatively stable ground to make the canals. And I think it all plays a role. I'd like to point our listeners to your blog. It's judithcurry.com, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes. And in the blog, you discuss some of these same issues, and people can keep up to date with your thinking by going to judithcurry.com. So we didn't talk about it yet, but it's sort of been implied in our conversation. It seems to be your view, and it seems to be my view as well, that climate change and global warming have become sort of convenient scapegoats for all of the other things that seem to ail the world. As an example, you write about how Nigeria blames climate change for the shrinking of Lake Chad, which, is an important wetland ecosystem that supports agriculture and fishing in the area. Now, in your mind, is this an example of how climate change is being used as a scapegoat? And can you explain why that is?
Okay, specifically with the Lake Chad example, in the 1980s and 1990s, the region experienced a horrendous drought. Okay, but since then, there's been a big recovery in terms of regional rainfall. But there's still very little water in Lake Chad. Well, what's going on? Well, they've redirected all the river flow that used to go into replenish Lake Chad into irrigating rice farms that aren't very productive. Okay, so I mean that's the that's why Lake Chad is still dry. If the rivers were allowed to naturally run free, then it would have replenished. But the politicians in the region just throw up their hand and say global warming, climate change, fossil fuels, we can't do anything about it. When it's related to their poor land management, that's caused the problem.
You see that phenomena more broadly with politicians. It's very convenient for politicians that have made bad decisions to say, well, this problem is the product of climate change, and therefore it's not my issue. And of course, it typically is their issue. Lots of different examples of climate change being used as a scapegoat spring to mind. Do you have any other favorites?
Well, a recent one in the U.S., do you remember the big forest fires in Maui a few years ago? Blamed on global warming. Well, a week in advance, the Weather Service predicted high winds and weather danger, and fire danger. Okay, and they didn't pay a heck of a lot of attention to that. And sure enough, a transmission line ended up starting a big fire that decimated the island. And you say, oh, climate change, global warming. No, it was just weather. Those kind of events occur all the time. But the interesting twist on this one is that they hadn't maintained the vegetation around the power lines adequately because they were so busy installing wind and solar power. So they didn't pay adequate attention to transmission line maintenance. And the other problem is that they've allowed invasive vegetation and grasses on the island, that are growing very rapidly and spreading very rapidly, and allowed the fire to spread much more rapidly than it otherwise would have. So it's poor vegetation management, allowing invasive vegetation on the island, not maintaining the transmission lines. I mean, those were the real cause of the disaster, and not paying attention to the weather forecast, and then they blame it on climate change. Okay, but they just throw up nothing we can do about it. They throw up their hands and say, climate change, fossil fuels, and our real problems don't get solved because of this scapegoating.
Exactly. That's the most frustrating aspect of it. You look at energy grid failures, and I've seen them blamed on climate and on global warming rather than on serious infrastructure neglect. And you see it with respect, you mentioned wildfires, you see it in urban flooding. And one of the more disingenuous ones I came across lately was, I think that it was about migration flows and saying that the great migrations around the world in the United States and in Europe these were climate refugees. But there's no scientific support for this, but they're asserted and not challenged in the media. So, coming back to the report just for a minute, when you do a report under a tight time constraint with a small group of people, it's necessary that the report be relatively brief and not in terrific depth. And I've heard that people criticize it for this, but given the time constraints, I don't see how it could have been otherwise. What this report does, however, it seems to set the stage for follow-up reports and, more importantly, perhaps for follow-up research. So in a world of limited resources, what would you like to see in terms of follow-ups to the Department of Energy climate report?
Well, first, I'd like to address the length and comprehensiveness of the report. Apart from the time constraints, we originally figured that a report of 100 pages was about the right length. Okay, we needed to really distill this down to the key arguments and the key supporting references and diagrams. So even if we had 3 times as much time, I don't think we would have wanted to increase the length a whole lot. In terms of the topics we selected, we obviously didn't cover every topic that the IPCC reports and the National Climate Assessment Report cover. There were 2 factors determining the topics we covered. First is we had to have the 5 team members had to have some sort of expertise on the topic. And secondly, we selected topics that we felt were not adequately addressed by the mainstream assessment reports and the topics that were most relevant for policymakers to understand. So those were the things that guided the topics that we selected. Now, the status of the DOE Climate Working Group is uncertain right now. To bring you up to date, there was a lawsuit filed by some enviro advocacy groups that said that it was illegally formed, illegally constituted, that we were really operating as a FACA, a federal advisory committee, and therefore it was illegal. We should be shut down and the report should be withdrawn. Well, what the DOE did is they shut down the Climate Working Group as an official entity, and they appealed, and they won on appeal that the report could remain, but that we were operating as a federal, a FACA group. So, that we weren't a kosher entity, if you will, to be advising the DOE. And given the recent shutdown, we haven't had updates from the DOE or the lawyers or anything. But the 5 of us are continuing with our original plan to issue a revised report. It may not be authored by the Climate Working Group per se, but with the 5 authors listed. Like I said, I'm in the process of finishing up a revised chapter on sea level rise. And the current plan is to issue a revised report after the first of the year, but we need to, talk with the DOE and whether this is published under the auspices of DOE or published just as an independent report by 5 authors that is posted on a website. We don't know yet, but there will be a revised version that specifically addresses the more serious critiques that we received about the first version of the report.
Well, I think our listeners will look forward to seeing the revised version. And, I have a lot of experience with FACA committees. And When you go down that rabbit hole, there's a lot to it, and a lot has to do with the role. Is it actually advising a federal agency, or is it making a study independent of advice to the agency? And there's just a ton of rules. So I wish you all well with that. But when I think about the report, when I look at the report, it was clear to me there would be a very negative reaction. There's sort of an industry, a climate change industry, and a lot of people's well-being financially and academically actually are tied to that. But one of your and your co-author's cardinal sins was to make the report broadly accessible. If the report had been 400 pages long and very difficult to read, it wouldn't have done as much good, and it also, I think, would have not fostered as strong a reaction. But it's very accessible. A person can read it and make sense of it without being a specialist. So, Judith, I enjoyed reading, and I think I benefited from reading your book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, Rethinking Our Response. How did the book do, and how'd that whole process work for you, and has the book been well received?
Yeah, the reviews, there have been a number of reviews, including, academic reviews, and they've been favorable. Again, there's been some Twitter trashing of the book, by the usual suspects, but that's to be expected. But there were some very thoughtful reviews published in law journals and, a number of unexpected places. The book has been translated into German and French, and Spanish and Chinese translations are underway. So I've been very gratified and surprised by the international reach. I mean, I get emails and, LinkedIn connections from people all over the world who've read the book. I can't really imagine how they found out about it, but I'm very gratified that they did. And it's impacting, the target audience was really decision makers and lawyers and people like that, rather than what I would call academic climate scientists, and also social sciences. My publisher, Anthem Press, and the series that I'm published in is really focused on the humanities and social sciences. So in many ways, that was the target audience rather than atmospheric scientists or whatever. Also, particularly, with the change in the political climate surrounding climate change, and particularly Bill Gates's essay, I'm seeing renewed interest in my book, from the media and elsewhere. People are asking, okay, well, the Paris Agreement and COP30, all that seems to be a bust. Now what do we do? And my book provides, a framing for how we might move forward on this issue in a sensible way. So, again, I'm very gratified by the response and, the people from all over the world that I've gotten in touch with through their email messages or LinkedIn messages. It's been very gratifying.
It is a very well done book, and I can see why it had such a positive response. Well, Judith, I appreciate you joining us once again on STEM Talk, and I suspect we will ask you to join us again, probably in a couple years, to give us an update. You're doing important work.
Thanks, Ken. Always a pleasure.
Pleasure is ours, and thank you again, Judith.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
It isn't easy to be a contrarian or a skeptic in climate science, which, as Judith reminded us, is deeply ironic. Science does not advance by consensus, and anything labeled settled science must remain open to new evidence and revision. Otherwise, it drifts from science into dogma that resists scrutiny. At its best, science is the continual asking of the skeptical question, the question that might overturn even our most confident hypotheses. But in today's narrative-driven world, rather than nullifying hypotheses, we too often nullify people. Judith's work is a reminder of why genuine scientific inquiry requires not only rigor, but also courage. If you enjoyed this interview as much as I did, I invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage, where you can find the show notes for this and other episodes at stemtalk.us. This is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.